Okay, here we go. All right, so, all right, hang on. I realized we're missing a slide. I want to talk first about what Long Island Sound Study is. So Long Island Sound Study is an estuary program who focuses in the sound. There are 28 national estuary programs across the U.S., and each of those programs is tasked with basically protecting, restoring, conserving, and caring for an estuary, which are very important ecosystems. They're basically where freshwater and saltwater meet, and they are very, very productive and very important for local economies. So in our case, we work to protect and conserve the sound and work with the communities and lands around the sound. So everything that we do, one other thing is that we are a big partnership. It's composed of the Environmental Protection Agency, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Connecticut Department of the Environment and Energy. I butchered Connecticut Deep, but whatever the order of the words is. New York Sea Grant, Connecticut Sea Grant, and a host of other partners, universities, interested environmental groups are all part of this partnership. And so everything that we do is guided by this plan called the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan, and the CCMP. And the CCMP is divided in 4 main themes. They are clean waters and healthy watersheds, thriving habitats and abundant wildlife, sustainable and resilient communities, and sound science and inclusive management. And within each of these themes, there are outcomes and objectives and strategies and specific actions to help guide us, to achieve these goals. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the CCMP also has cross-cutting principles, which basically means that these are principles that are supposed to be part of everything we do across all of our themes, right? So these 3 cross-cutting principles are long-term sustainability, climate resiliency, and environmental justice, which is why this working group exists. Next slide, please. So this is the revision I talked about in the beginning. So this plan that I just talked about, the CCMP, is revised every 10 years. Our current one is from 2015, which means that we are due. And we are working, we're going to be working on this revision this year in 2024. The Comprehensive Conservation Management Plan includes a vision, a mission, values, goals, objectives, actions, and they are all getting revised this year. And what's important to note here is that, obviously we want to try and keep what we're going to hear about today about the EJ needs assessment, what we heard through that as we move in this revision. And there will also be public engagement sessions that will take place in May, in September, and in October of this year. We also included here the draft vision and mission statements. So the vision is Long Island Sound and its watershed have clean waters, healthy habitats, thriving wildlife, resilient coasts, and an engaged public. And the mission being the Long Island Sound Study leads a collective effort to restore and care for the sound and its watershed. So next slide, please. All right, so why we're here in terms of the Environmental Justice Working Group. So our mission statement as a working group is to promote the incorporation of environmental justice into Long Island Sound Study decision-making and implementation of all CCMP goals. So like I said, EJ is a cross-cutting principle in our CCMP, and what we try to do is figure out actionable ways to make it apparent across all themes. We have a 2-pronged strategy to achieve this. One is inward facing, so more focused inwardly in our program and how we operate, fostering internal learning and education of environmental justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion within the Long Island Sound Study Partnership. And our second strategy is engagement and relationship building, so improving our outreach to build and sustain relationships with new and diverse partners within the Long Island Sound watershed focusing on environmental justice groups and communities. And I think
I'm gonna pause here because we have someone in the waiting room, and because I'm working from a web browser, I can't actually help you out.
Okay. I think the next slide is yours, so I can figure that out and hand over.
All right, thank you so much. And I will take over for a little bit. So because we have a lot of new people here, I'm gonna go through in a little bit more detail this work plan diagram that we've created for the Environmental Justice Work Group. This work plan diagram has already been through one major revision, and we look at it as a living document as we continue to get more representation in the decision-making process. We will keep coming back to this plan to make sure that this actually reflects the needs and values of the communities that we're actually trying to help with the existence of the environmental justice work in the Long Island Sound. So we identified a problem, the lack of representation and inclusion of marginalized and underserved communities and their needs in Long Island Sound decision-making and implementation. And we identified 3 goals to kind of work towards: to improve DEIJ literacy among existing partners, to ensure an inclusive work environment, and to effectively view projects through a DEIJ lens, to meaningfully engage marginalized and underserved groups in Long Island Sound decision-making processes, and to ensure that all EJ needs pertinent to the CCMP within the watershed are fully identified and addressed. And we identified some objectives to go with those goals. We wanted to identify the barriers to Long Island Sound study representation and access to resources, examine Long Island Sound implementation projects and develop a process to hold the program accountable to EJ priorities, set aside funds for EJ engagement and implementation, establish meaningful, strong working relationships with marginalized and underserved groups, and create mechanisms, resources, programs, and et cetera, as necessary to support the meaningful involvement of new partners in Long Island Sound work groups and committees. And the bolded and underlined objective was the one that the existing EJ work group thinks is probably our top priority at the moment. And so that's why we've bolded it and outlined it. So what you see here are color-coded arrows that go from the objectives to the tasks, and that's how we think we're trying to address these objectives. For example, under establish meaningful, strong working relationships with marginalized and underserved groups, you'll see that we have 2 maroon, we have 3 lines, one going to the Community Impact Fund, one going up to our engagement efforts, and one going across to the exploration of an EJ committee. So we're hoping that by doing these tasks, we're actually meeting those three tasks, we're actually helping to meet that objective. And so that's how you read this diagram across the way. And each one of these tasks is numbered. If you look into the upper upper right corner of each task, you'll see a number. And so what we hope for are a certain number of outputs and results, and we've number coded the outputs and results. So we hope that task 1 will help us to meet the output or result of community needs and barriers to participation have been identified, that we get new collaborations and connections with local groups, that LISS programmatic gaps, barriers, and needs are identified, and needed trainings and changes are initiated. And let's look down for another number 1. And the progress towards representative decision-making is happening. So this is how we've kind of sorted this out. And everything I've explained is actually in this paragraph down below. So we will have lots of opportunity for discussion. So if there are questions about this diagram, you can also bring that up when we are in our open discussion session. So we have, so this next part is updates on what we've done so far for this year for tasks. And so for this year, when it comes to our engagement efforts, we have been having our engagement professionals working on the EJ needs assessment, and today we're going to see the results of that in our major presentation, which is the next thing on the list. The assessment is complete. Today's presentation is a part of those results, and the LISS team is continuing to work on additional community meetings. We're going to, over the next year, be circulating the report, sharing the results, and trying to incorporate the results of the needs assessment into the CCMP revision and into annual work plans. So for our internal assessment, which is what we're doing to kind of assess where the existing partnership is on how much we understand environmental justice, where our training needs are for understanding the impacts of diversity, equity, inclusion, and environmental justice are on the work that we do and how to incorporate it. Where we've got an assessment that we're working on putting together, but we need to follow some policy rules under the Paperwork Reduction Act. I'm not going to get into the complications of it, but suffice it to say that the paperwork has been submitted. It has not yet been submitted all the way to HQ, but once that happens and they approve it, we'll be able to move forward with the assessment, with the survey tool and focus groups. So we have also submitted, New York Sea Grant has submitted a supplemental proposal for this year to get funds to support additional trainings in fiscal year 25 that will address the gaps that have been identified by the results of our internal assessment that will help us do that training. We have next on the list for updates is Restore America's Estuary. So I'm going to turn it over to Shahela for a little bit, and I've got your slides up in this list right now, Shahela. So I'll just move on to your first slide.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Shahela Begum, and I'm with Restore America's Estuaries, and I'm also the program director of the Long Island Sound Community Impact Fund. As you know, we launched the first round of funding, and we're currently in the process of doing full proposals. And so just a quick overview, Ray plans to award 1.5 million in federal funds for the first round, and typical awards will range from about 5,000 to up to 100,000. We're also planning for the annual learning exchange, and also including stipends to attend, investing in training programs to prepare for grants, not only this one, but also future grants, and also planning to strengthen and diversify connections within the Long Island Sound study. Next slide. So just a quick update on the number of LOIs that we received. We received a total of 35 applicants with a request amount of over 2.5 million. 11 applicants were from Connecticut, requesting over 700,000. 24 applicants from New York, requesting over 1.8 million. 28 of the applications have been moved to the full proposal stage, and they are due on March 15th, and we'll be announcing awards from mid to late April. And on June 27th, we'll hold an annual learning exchange, so all the organizations and partners can come together in person. Projects will start on July 1st, and it will be complete on July 31st of next year. Next slide. And the overall plan moving on forward from now into the future is to continue the capacity building trainings that we had one-on-one talks with community leaders and executive directors of CBOs, along with the environmental justice needs assessment that will really influence on what the gaps are missing and what kind of trainings are needed. Also trainings on management of federal grants. So just tech support around that area, whether it be bookkeeping, comms, things like that. And all these trainings are also at no cost to participants. And Also, the annual learning exchange, as I mentioned, will be held in June, more details to follow. And this will be an opportunity for tech transfer, for folks to learn from one another on project specific ideas, but also, like I said, grant management and things like that. And so we'll have more information to follow, but if everyone wants to hold June 27th as hold the date. And also we have next Thursday a fundraising webinar, and you can find the registration for that on the Ray website. And that'll be a training just to kind of get the skills to fundraise for projects and kind of expand that way. But more to follow. And for those of you who want to kind of stay in tune, you can sign up for the Ray newsletter, the LISS gift newsletter, which is on the Ray website. It's a little bit targeted and you'll get updates way. And I'll pass it back to you, Jimena.
Thanks. So just to continue on, as you know, we've been working on trying to incorporate environmental justice into all parts of Long Island Sound study, and that has began with a long set of conversations with all of our work groups and committees. And we've added an item to our task list based on those conversations and the progress that we've moved forward, which is to work on developing action items to integrate EJ priorities into our work plans. And we think that the needs assessment is going to be really key to helping us identify what those action items could be. But we are planning to be a major part of the EJ work group's efforts this year are going to be actually incorporating the results of our internal assessment and the needs assessment and any other learning that we come through over the next year into the CCMP revision to more fully integrate EJ into Long Island Sound study and kind of work this work group out of existence. So from here, that's the last of our regular slides. And we are just 5 minutes late for our next presentation, which I will hand over to Amanda because I see she is already ready to go, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thanks, Bessie. All right, and I'm going to start sharing my screen. So.
Should I present you? Do you want me to present
sure.
you? Or?
Sorry, no,
I mean, so yeah, just to provide a little bit of context for anybody who's not been familiar with this project, we've been working on the environmental justice needs assessment for the Long Island Sound region for all of last year. And we've done that with the help of responsive management and specifically with the fabulous Amanda and Maddie who joined us here today. So responsive management is a social science research firm that has been specializing in attitudes and opinions about natural resources and the environment for more than 30 years. Amanda Center has worked for responsive management for 10 years and has worked on a number of coastal and environmental needs assessments throughout the US and assisted state agencies and federal agencies and NGOs in the efforts to better understand the needs of the public. Madeline Dura is a social science researcher and a community engagement practitioner who comes to us from the San Francisco Bay watershed region. Throughout 2018 and 2021, Maddie led the Disadvantaged Community and Tribal Involvement Program, or DACTI program, needs assessment in the San Francisco Bay Area. And since its completion, she continues supporting the development of community and tribal-led projects to address identified issues through capacity building and technical support. So once again, thanks so much for to both of you for being here and for all the work that you've put into this. And yeah, take it away.
Thanks, Amanda. So I'm Amanda, and I, along with Maddie, work for responsive management, as Amanda just said. And today we're going to be presenting some information and findings from the Environmental Justice Needs Assessment conducted for the Long Island Sound Study. So today we're going to be going over components of the methodology, some broad findings of the needs identified by communities, some broad findings of the needs identified by community-based organizations, and some recommendations based on the findings. And then finally, the broad themes that emerged during the needs assessment. And with regard to the findings we present today, it's important to understand that these findings are broad. The Long Island Sound region is large, densely populated, and incredibly diverse. So each community has its own unique priorities, challenges, and needs. And although the information we're presenting today looks at the assessment through a broader lens, the overall report that will be available later this month will include information we heard from specific communities and in specific regions. So as I mentioned, we'll start with methodology. And the aim of this project was to build relationships and connections with LISS partners and community-based groups and leaders, to find out more about the needs of disadvantaged communities and community groups, and ultimately to use the findings from this project to inform future environmental management programming in the CCMP. And all of this was done in close and constant collaboration with LISS partners to ensure that all of the relationship building that was conducted during this process would last long after the project was complete. And in order to fulfill these objectives, we started with an exploratory phase that included a review of previous research and projects done in the area, interviews with LISS partners, and reviews of definitions, indicators, and mapping tools that help develop an understanding of the disadvantaged communities in the region. And next, we conducted in-depth interviews with community-based organizations and leaders to develop an understanding of their needs and experiences and to begin to understand the needs of the community more. And based on the findings from the exploratory phase and the interviews, we worked collaboratively with LISS to develop a needs assessment survey. And note that all aspects, as can seen in this illustration, all aspects of this project played a part in developing the needs assessment survey and making sure the survey was asking the right questions to help develop an understanding of community needs. And the needs assessment survey was then administered to residents from disadvantaged communities in the Long Island Sound region throughout New York and Connecticut. And based on the findings from the previous stages of the project, we conducted community listening sessions in several communities in the region in order to collect more feedback about specific environmental justice issues in communities. And note that although we did not hold community listening sessions in every community around the Sound, as the locations of listening sessions were selected based on capacity, the findings from the exploratory phase, available space and time, and other components, we did collect survey data from all disadvantaged communities around the Sound. And an important aspect of this project is that each stage built on the previous stage and informed the stage that followed. So we mentioned the project aim, and we've given some details about the methodology, but we're going to further explain the findings based on the 4 major goals of the needs assessment. And the first goal of the needs assessment was to develop an understanding of how overburdened communities relate to and use the Sound. The second goal was to understand barriers to participation in LISS events, resources, and decision-making. Third, we wanted to better understand barriers to equitable and safe access to the Sound and its resources. And finally, we wanted to develop an understanding of the environmental hazards and injustices disproportionately affecting overburdened communities. So next, we're going to go into some of the broad findings and needs identified by community members. And the broad findings identified by community members will be grouped by which of the 4 major needs assessment goals the information applies to. So the first section of community identified needs will show information about how overburdened communities relate to and use the Sound and its resources. So before I begin, I want to explain how many of the graphs in this section are going to be laid out. Most of the graphs are going to show the results for disadvantaged groups and the results for non-disadvantaged groups for comparison. And as a quick explanation of how a respondent was classified as disadvantaged, we used several pieces of data. First, we started surveys off with a question that asked respondents to indicate if any environmental justice indicators applied to them. And these indicators included living near a pollution source, being low income, having difficulty with transportation, being a non-English speaker, and others. And the entire list of indicators will be included in the needs assessment report coming later this month, but these were based on the indicators of disadvantaged communities established in the Justice 40 initiative. So in order to be classified as disadvantaged, a respondent would have to select one or more of those indicators and have one or more demographic characteristics that were also indicative of disadvantaged individuals, such as reporting a low income when asked for their specific income, as opposed to self-identifying as low income, or belonging to a minority group, among others. And the first finding shown here shows that disadvantaged respondents indicated that they're not using the Sound as often as non-disadvantaged groups. And the next slide here is highlighting the broad finding that many people do not know about the sound. Some communities are more aware of the sound than others, but as we heard in a lot of our conversations, many communities and community members are not aware of the watershed, or they're not even sure where the sound is. And we feel that some of these quotes highlight that point. One is from a resident of Long Island, where they seemed unsure where the sound was. And the final comment here is from a Mount Vernon community member who showed that some perceptions of the sound are not always correct. And so the next finding we have is that respondents indicated that they're often using the sound just to spend time in nature. And as you can see on this graph, among both groups, people are spending time on the water with friends or family, or just walking along the shoreline or exploring. And as can be seen in the graph around the middle here, a larger number of disadvantaged respondents indicated that they're using the sound for fishing. So in this next question, instead of asking what they use the sound for, we asked them what they'd most like to use the sound for. And as you can see, the answers were pretty similar. In community conversations, we also heard this. We heard people talk about just remembering spending time at the beach, walking on the shoreline as a kid, and wanting more opportunities for these kinds of activities. Many community members indicated that they want their children and their grandchildren to enjoy the sound in the same way they did when they were younger. And note also, again, on the last slide, disadvantaged respondents indicated that they're fishing more often, and they would like to use the sound for fishing at a greater rate than non-disadvantaged respondents, as you can see here. Another thing that we learned during this process is that people in disadvantaged communities want to participate in environmental activities and events such as cleanups and nature walks, as you can see here as the top two responses. However, it was also stressed during community conversations that being engaged has to be easy, it has to be beneficial to individuals or the community, and it shouldn't provide any additional burdens. We also heard that community members want to participate in events and activities that are relevant and meaningful to their communities. Some community members do not want to participate in events that teach fishing in areas with fish advisories, while others are very interested in safe fishing practices and learning to fish. And so some participants specifically recommended that activities and educational events should be connected to improving access in their community specifically and connecting to policy. And some suggested that events should be the start of something that participants can continue on their own. So the next finding here is that disadvantaged communities have a greater need for information about the safety of waterways and specific species for fishing and shellfishing. And among those disadvantaged respondents who indicated that they are fishing in the sound, disadvantaged respondents indicated that they're subsistence fishing at a greater rate, highlighting the importance of providing information. So you can see this in the graph circled in red. Disadvantaged communities, respondents rather, indicated that they're fishing for a primary source of food for themselves or their families far more often than non-disadvantaged respondents. So in combination with the fact that disadvantaged respondents indicated that they are subsistence fishing at a greater rate, we see here that they're less concerned with their health as a result of consuming fish and shellfish. And this again indicates a clear need for more information to ensure that they're safely consuming what they catch in the sound. So this next finding is that respondents indicated that they need more information about how and where to access waterways and events. And the information you see shows how people relate to the sound, in that it shows that more information might make them feel safer and want to participate more. But it also leads perfectly into our next section about barriers, because this information shows that a barrier to accessing the sound and attending events might be a lack of information overall. So the next series of slides is going to include information about barriers to participation, LISS events, resources, and decision-making. So first, we have a few quotes here as an example of the finding that many people are not familiar with LISS. And we heard this in a lot of communities, a lot of conversations. Who is LISS? What do they do? And as I think Jimena or Bessie said earlier on, there's a lot of different components to LISS. So some folks said, I need a map to understand how all these groups work together. And next, we have the findings that demographics typically associated with disadvantaged groups were less likely to participate in activities and events. And before I go on, I want to briefly explain this graph. This is a demographic graph. So the striped bar in the middle shows the percentage of respondents overall who said they participated in an activity or event. And in either direction of that bar, you see the percentage of different demographics that have been to an activity or event. So for example, females right above there, that's the percentage of females who indicated that they had participated. And as you can see toward the bottom of the graph, we start to see that those demographics that are often seen in disadvantaged communities are attending and participating in events less often. So an important rule about these kinds of graphs is that statistical significance is shown with a difference of about 4 to 5 percentage points. So here you can see that these bottom numbers, such as education level of high school graduate or less, household income under 40,000, are indeed statistically significant. This one may seem a bit obvious, but this next finding is important to consider when planning events or trying to engage with communities. And that is that overburdened community members have competing priorities that often prevent them from being involved in events and conversations. This is important because the inability to be involved does not equal a lack of interest. Now, this quote from the New Haven listening session perfectly sums up what we heard during many conversations across the region. And that is, we had so many people tell us they wanted to be here. We had over 50 people respond to the invitation, but if they have to work or take care of their kids, they can't come to things like this. When respondents indicated that they had not participated in an activity or event, they were asked a follow-up question about why they hadn't participated. And a large majority of respondents indicated that they had not participated because they just hadn't been aware. And this really emphasizes 2 additional findings. Number 1, people want to be in nature and they want to participate in activities and events. And 2, they just need more information to do so. So the final slide in this section shows that specific services and resources would encourage greater participation in activities and events. And interestingly, as you can see on this graph, stipends did not actually rate that high. People are interested in having food, transportation to and from events, and the necessary tools and equipment they need to participate in the event. And as we've mentioned, many disadvantaged community members have competing priorities, and offering services and resources, in some cases, could break through that barrier. And next, we're going to be showing information about barriers to equitable and safe access to the sound and its resources. So here again, we have a demographic graph, but this time showing use of the sound. And what we're showing with the striped line again is the percentage of all respondents who have used the sound. And in either direction of that striped line are the percentages of each of those groups who have used the sound. So again, you can see that demographics that are typically indicative of disadvantaged groups report consistently using the sound less, such as Black or African American respondents and respondents with household incomes under $40,000. Although this may seem like something that we already know, this graph is really important in that it shows clear data that some people are not accessing or not able to access the sound as much as other groups. When asked what changes would make it easier for residents in their community to access the sound, the top response was simply knowing where to go. So again, that boils down to that information point. So transportation is the #1 constraint to using the sound, according to survey respondents. And while this graph shows that similarities exist across Long Island Sound communities and that many respondents from many different communities said transportation problems prevented them from using the sound, as we mentioned early on, it's really important to consider specific contexts and different priorities in communities. For example, in one listening session, participants spoke about the removal of benches and shelters at bus stops, which had limited the use of public transit. In another location, we heard that public transit doesn't have enough hours on Saturdays, which makes weekends, when people actually have time for recreation, a more difficult time to travel. In another community, we were told that beaches closest to disadvantaged communities are often cluttered with trash and debris, and public transit is expensive if you wish to travel further to get to a cleaner beach. And the final slide in this section includes several quotes to illustrate the finding that a lack of clean and safe outdoor spaces in which people can recreate is a major barrier for many. And the first quote touches on compounding issues in some communities, such as issues with transportation and issues with areas with trash and debris buildup. And in the second quote, the community member notes that they feel that their waterway is filled with industrial pollution, which makes it unsafe and makes people unsure how to handle those things. So next, Maddie is going to be presenting information about the environmental hazards and injustices disproportionately affecting overburdened communities.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I'm going to start by showing a series of maps from the EPA's environmental justice screening tool with hazards and injustices that disproportionately impact overburdened communities, as well as sharing some examples of the specific ways that we heard that these issues manifest and overlap in different communities that we spoke with around the sound. So this first map shows food deserts. We talked to people in many areas around the Sound who described concerns about lack of access to fresh food. And on this map, you can see that areas in Stamford and Bridgeport, New Haven, Groton, and New London, as well as some areas on Long Island, including Riverhead, are recognized as food deserts. And residents not always having access to healthy food came up in conversations with groups in Groton, specifically around the Five Corners area, as well as Bridgeport. Also came up in areas of Nassau County, even though on the environmental justice screening tool, this map in particular doesn't elevate some of those areas that we heard those concerns in. Next slide, please. On this map, you can see that many of the areas that are considered food deserts are also low income, and that's in part due to how food deserts are described. And it also begins to illustrate how many of these social and environmental burdens cumulatively impact certain areas. In many interviews and community conversations, we heard about very large wealth disparities in the region. We also heard about how low-income areas often overlap with areas that are more heavily impacted by and exposed to pollution and flooding, such as in Eastern Connecticut is one example. Next slide, please. And so many of these cumulative burdens can contribute to a low life expectancy. And you can see areas in the 80th and 90th percentile in the South Bronx on this map, areas in the 100th percentile in Bridgeport, New Haven, Norwich, and New London. In the Bronx, we heard a lot of people talk about industrial and commercial pollution and a lack of regulation for trucks and barges, and how the proximity of roadways and industry to communities causes air quality issues. And from those disproportionately high rates of asthma, especially in Black and Brown communities. Next slide, please. This is the flood risk map with red indicating that in areas in the 95th to 100th percentile. And we heard repeatedly about the dangers of flooding in communities in New York and Connecticut and how flood risk disproportionately burdens already vulnerable communities. One interview in New York shared an example related to how inhabitants of illegal basement apartments in Queens were disproportionately harmed and even killed during Hurricane Ida. The interview participant explained that many of the residents who lived in these apartments did so out of financial necessity, not being able to afford apartments that might provide better protections against storms or flooding. And many of these folks also lacked access to the internet or other forms of public information. And during Hurricane Ida, some of these residents were unaware of the potential dangers and unable to evacuate in time to escape harm from flooding. Next slide, please. This map shows hazardous waste proximity, and some of the communities that we see most impacted are some of those same communities again, from New Haven and Bridgeport to Stamford, New London, and Riverhead on Long Island. We also see Westchester County, the Bronx, and Queens with a lot of red, yellow, and orange on this map. And a lot of areas on Long Island and around the Sound have an industrial past. In Glen Cove, we heard about issues and concerns in the area associated with PFAs and freon particulates from industry. We also heard about the submarine industry in Southeast Connecticut, how a popular fishing area in Groton, Connecticut is also an industrial area, and about concerns related to industrial sites near waterways in Stamford. We also heard about from community members about how Bridgeport was created as an industrial city and how the area was seen as a place to put infrastructure and services that no one else wanted that were toxic, such as tanneries, transportation hubs, and sewage plants. Next slide, please. In Bridgeport, we also heard about how the WPCA, the Water Pollution Control Authority, has been dumping raw sewage into the Sound. And this obviously caused a lot of concern over the safety of swimming and eating fish that are caught in the area. And there's a sentiment shared that it's important for everyone to better understand how interconnected the communities on the Sound are, and that raw sewage going into the Sound in one area impacts everyone. And so this presentation is an overview of some of these environmental justice concerns in a very large, very diverse region. And these are just a few of the indicators from the EPA environmental justice screening tool. And there are many more examples about how these and other burdens manifest in different communities around the Sound that we heard and that we didn't hear. And we wanted to show a few of these maps to emphasize how these issues manifest and cumulatively burden different communities in unique ways, and want to highlight how this underlines the imperative for communities to be included in decision-making early and often to ensure that work and priorities are in step and understand these histories and these unique needs and histories and are in step with them. Next slide, please. And so as Amanda mentioned and was said many times over the course of this effort, many overburdened community members have competing priorities. One of the things that we heard most often was that not having time is a huge barrier to being able to access the Sound and take part in existing programming and resources. One person who we spoke with at the Riverhead Public Library shared I don't have time to go to the beach because I have to work 2 jobs to afford low-income housing, and that low-income housing in Long Island costs almost $2,000 a month, and shared how they don't feel like they really even have time to spend with their kids. Next slide, please. And in this vein, when asked, many participants also often prioritize needs associated with social and infrastructure priorities. Many people shared about how difficult it can be to think about or to prioritize the sound and other natural spaces when you're working multiple jobs to pay rent and feed your family, or to think about recreation access when you don't feel safe where you live. And many people we spoke with also shared about how a history of exclusion and a lack of access to safe and clean outdoor spaces has created feelings in some communities that the outdoors aren't accessible or welcoming. A group we spoke with in the Bronx shared that many students haven't been to the Bronx River or the Long Island Sound despite their proximity because many people don't know they're there. And many areas are often surrounded by warehouses and industry, and parks are scattered throughout the community. One person who we talked with who grew up in Yonkers shared that it wasn't until she had an opportunity through a youth organization to first see a salt marsh, and emphasized how organizations in urban areas that introduce young people like her to the environment are necessary because many don't have access to a safe, clean environment nearby. Many people we spoke with also highlighted the importance of making those explicit links between public health and other social and infrastructure issues that disproportionately impact overburdened communities and the natural environment, including making connections between asthma rates and poor air quality. Next slide, please. And then overall environmental health. So some people we talked with shared about a fear for safety that some Black and Brown communities have as a result of centuries of being excluded or denied access to waterways. And some people talked about not feeling welcome or safe in outdoor spaces. This was both due to people acting in ways that made them not feel welcome, as well as aspects of the physical spaces themselves, such as areas that have been gated or that haven't been kept clean. Many people we talked with expressed concern about the amount of trash and illegal dumping near waterways, and many expressed concern about the safety of water quality in the sounds. A lot of people explicitly asked whether certain activities such as fishing or swimming were safe and wanted to know more. Next slide, please. So very, very importantly, something we heard from many people we spoke to is that people who live in areas that are overburdened really want to see action. Some communities feel like there's a lot of studying, but very little funding and action going into improving their communities. And so the most important part of this work is going to be what's next, how this information is followed up on for the region as a whole and in each specific area. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to present some of the broad findings from community-based organizations. It's important to note that often these organizations are working on addressing many of the issues identified within various communities and are directly connected to the community identified needs in that way. Next slide, please. One of the major barriers that was often shared was that many community groups are overextended. This slide includes several quotes directly from community-based organizations. One group shared when responding about our request to hear from them related to this effort. I wish I could have reached out sooner, but we don't have the time or the money to do much of anything other than what we're doing. And we often heard from many of these groups that they might have started working on one thing, but in response to needs in their communities have expanded their missions. And these expanding missions and work to meet many needs with limited budgets and staff has made it difficult for many groups to take on additional work or collaborations without funding sufficient for adding additional staff to support the work. Next slide, please. Many groups being overextended connects to another barrier that many groups often shared. Oftentimes, grant partnership and other opportunity timelines are too short to meaningfully collaborate with, support, and ensure participation from lower capacity community-based organizations. Longer lead times for partnerships and funding opportunities are really needed. The quotes on this slide were from two particular groups, but reflect a sentiment that was widely reported. Many groups don't have a dedicated grant writer, but rather a few staff who take on many roles. And if funding opportunity timelines are short and one staff member is out for some, that might mean needing to wait for the next cycle to apply. And this is, again, really connected to the previous barrier that many groups overextended, and something we ran into often in this process. On a short timeline, many collaborations and otherwise really important work might not happen if it needs to happen on that short time frame. We heard from one community member that urgency is the enemy of trust. And we also often heard about how meaningful partnerships and community-based work often don't happen on current grant timelines. Next slide, please. Overall, a really major takeaway from these conversations was that in general, there's not currently enough funding that goes directly to community-based groups for community-based work to address existing issues and to support visioning. One community group shared that while there are a lot of people in their community who need and more who could benefit from their programs, they can't expand them, and in some cases have had to close them due to lack of funding. We also heard that often the funding that is available might not go directly to a community-based organization or might be tied to a program and not able to cover things like general operating expenses and other necessities for organizations to function. And this connects directly to a quote that was on the previous slide. Funding is nice, but funding doesn't create time. Another group shared that it doesn't really matter how many resources we get if we can't use them. There needs to be a process in which we can go from resource to actualization. We really need to establish a pipeline where we are supported while we try to actualize things. Next slide, please. Given that we heard that many organizations are overextended and need additional funding, also often came up in conversations that reimbursement-based funding is highly untenable for many groups. Many groups don't have the funding to front large amounts of work or money and wait several months or even a month for reimbursement. One group shared that communities are expected to front the money and then hire an expert in federal grants management to make sure they get it back, and they can't afford to take that risk. Another asked, why are so many grants reimbursement-based? What the communities are hearing is they don't trust us. We have to be partnered with a big NGO or somebody that they think is going to cover our costs, which doesn't happen anymore. Next slide, please. And in turn, many groups expressed feeling levels of distrust with government and public agencies. This was often due to many feeling that these groups aren't taking responsibility for addressing issues, or due to some agencies' past roles in issues related to redlining or other discriminatory decision-making practices, or due to past broken promises and lived experiences with not being included in consequential decision-making processes. One group shared that there's a lot of hopelessness and anxiety. There have been large infrastructure changes, but those infrastructure changes are happening in the biggest tax brackets, and communities with lower tax brackets aren't getting the attention, and this is causing mistrust among the most vulnerable communities. They just aren't getting the support that they need. And this distrust can complicate efforts to address some issues and priorities. Next slide, please. An overall sentiment that was shared throughout the process was that many people don't feel like they're always as involved in the decision-making processes that affect them as they should be. One community member expressed frustration around what community input is sought for. They shared this quote, "Yes, let's get community input, but it's usually for good things and bad things not so much. When developers were installing 5G towers in Bridgeport, they weren't getting any community input, but then we spent 3 years getting community input to build a playground." Next slide, please. So we've shared a lot of major barriers and findings from community members and organizations. And most importantly, we want to connect these existing needs to the Long Island Sound Study and actions that can be taken to address them and to support community groups who are currently doing this work. So all of the recommendations that we'll present are based on and connected with the needs that were identified by community members and community groups that were presented earlier in the presentation. Next slide, please. So to start with recommendations to meet some of the community needs, you heard earlier in this presentation how many community members have competing priorities, and this makes it particularly important to and drives the recommendation to incentivize engagement to appeal to people with competing interests. This can be done in many ways, including, as Amanda shared, offering food, stipends, childcare, and transportation. You also heard that many of the needs that were prioritized through this process were related to social and infrastructure issues. And although many social and infrastructure issues may seemingly be outside of the purview of the Long Island Sound Study, Long Island Sound Study can and should encourage partnerships and collaborations with other agencies and community organizations that focus on other community and infrastructure challenges, such as housing or public health, which we heard a lot about, to facilitate projects that result in co-benefits from those projects to overburdened communities. And next slide, please. And you also heard earlier in the presentation that many people want to spend time in nature and access the sounds. And the Long Island Sound region is highly diverse and many different languages are spoken. And currently many signs and a lot of information are only available in English. And so a recommendation that we heard many times in many settings was that signs and informational materials should always be translated into multiple language. And this can make many more people feel welcome. It's also particularly important that all information be translated. Some groups share that oftentimes they only saw negative information being translated, like a sign in an area to show that it's off limits, but not interpretive and educational science to enrich the experiences of everyone. Also in the vein of education and information sharing, as you heard from Amanda, many community members and community-based organizations were not familiar with the Long Island Sound Study, and some didn't know much about the Long Island Sound or where it is. And many groups and individuals we talked with asked for, and something that the Long Island Sound Study can provide, is more information through multiple means about where the sound is, where and how it can be accessed, and about the Long Island Sound Study itself, and existing programs and events and ways for people to access resources and be involved. Next slide, please. As you heard, many community members and groups expressed concerns over the safety of water in the sound, and many people asked us whether certain activities such as fishing or swimming were safe. One community group asked why fishing lessons would be taught if the fish in the sound weren't safe to eat, if the water was polluted. And some also shared about the fear, again, for safety that some Black and Brown communities have as a result of centuries of being excluded or denied access to waterways. And the Long Island Sound Study and other partners can provide more information about water quality and safety through more avenues, including at access points, as well as materials and activities that focus on the why to respectfully inform recreational use and subsistence fishing activities. And another important recommendation to meet these needs that were identified is to support or develop programs that give people greater confidence in their ability to recreate safely in and around the sound, including specifically swimming lessons. Next slide, please. So throughout this process, we've heard so much about how important relationship building and trust are. And relationship building really takes time and support and commitment, and continuing to show up supports developing relationships and trust. And so as an overarching recommendation, it's first and foremost extremely important for the Long Island Sound Study to continue to follow up with those groups and communities who are engaged in this process, as well as new partners, and to identify avenues for further developing these relationships, building trust, and gathering continuous feedback to ensure that the Long Island Sound Study's work is in step with community priorities. One specific recommendation to support doing this is through having dedicated staff for outreach, relationship building, and listening to understand community needs, which would also support the Long Island Sound Study in being in step with community needs. One additional position that could be hired for, in particular, is an extension professional to cover New York City. While there's extension professionals that cover most of the rest of the sound, New York City would really benefit from an extension professional to build relationships and trust in the Long Island Sound Study in the region. It's also extremely important that communities are engaged in all decision-making that will impact them through the entire decision-making process, not just at the end and not just on good things, but from the beginning. Communities should be engaged in planning and decision-making processes that will impact them. And the Long Island Sound Study should ensure in its programs and resources that communities are brought in early and often. Next slide, please. As for recommendations for supporting meeting community-based organizations' identified needs, we shared earlier that many community-based organizations are overextended, and the Long Island Sound Study could work to develop programs specifically for different community groups that are in line with their strategic priorities and that don't require them to do any additional work. This could look like partnering with a local health department to offer a walk with a doctor program where participants could access healthcare while also learning about and having the opportunity to spend time on the sound. And additionally, as you heard, additional funding is really needed, and reimbursement funding is untenable for many groups, and the Long Island Sound Study and partners should explore ways to take risks when it comes to funding and supporting frontline community-based organizations directly. Next slide, please. So before we move on to discussing what comes next, we want to highlight some of the major themes that came out of this process as a whole. Some of those major themes from a lot of the conversations that we've had have included access to waterways and safety concerns, access to information and recreational opportunities, flooding and erosion, disconnections from the environment, water and air quality concerns and infrastructure, as well as systemic concerns. So thank you so much for your time. I'm going to pass it to Jimena and the Long Island Sound Study team to share about what is coming next.
Thank you so much, Maddie and Amanda. That was super helpful. We have a lot to talk about. I guess what I want to say now is, like I said, we've been working on this project for a year and hearing from communities across the Sound. And The good news is that some of what we heard, especially with community-based organizational needs, some of it we already have programs that we've begun working on through Long Island Sound Community Impact Fund or through the work of the Sustainable and Resilient Communities Group. There are already resources that we have that can help meet those needs. And so through this process, we were able to kind of share those resources with some of the people we spoke with. But there are a lot of other needs that we found through this process. And what comes next is thinking through how we can incorporate this into what we do and establish considerations within our programming to help alleviate these challenges and community needs. So right now, what I'm going to do is, the final thing I'll say is that next step is up to us, mostly the Environmental Justice Working Group. And that's what I foresee we'll be working on this coming year. And we'll have, this is just the beginning of this conversation, and we'll continue kind of diving deeper and thinking through this throughout the year and as we move forward with the CCMP revision. So at this time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up for, are there any questions or any comments or initial thoughts or anything like that?
I'll just jump in and say we, like Jimena said when she was discussing the agenda, we didn't want to limit the opportunity for people to speak about their initial thoughts right now, especially the people who are here, who are not usually here and want to provide input. So we're basically going to play it by ear. The breakout sessions where we go into a deeper dive, if they don't happen today, they will happen at the next EJ meeting. So this is step one, and we just didn't want to make people feel rushed about how we discuss things right now. Denise.
Hi, yes, thank you. And thank you for the information. It's always good to see it again with fresh eyes. I just wanted to say that I think the theme here is on the outreach, education, communication piece. Just even people knowing what Long Island Sound is. I just wanted to share that the organization I'm involved in is involved with another federal program, and we're doing some listening sessions on specifically impact on shell fishing and some other stuff like that. But we kind of did what we call across the whole state, not just Long Island Sound, locally led work groups. But one of the things we heard from environmental justice communities is that, let's say for when they're using open space, they don't feel that they know how to use it. They like programming. And the reason I'm bringing this up is within this sphere, it's not where we always put our funds. We don't always put our funds into environmental education. I mean, we have some, but it's not where we put the majority of the funds. And I think that to get this group involved, up to speed, where they want to be in their place, that we really need to focus more funds. And I think it's something that we can start thinking about as we move forward. The plan is, making sure that we're doing not only, education outreach on listening, that because of what we're going to be planning, but also just doing general environmental education programming at parks, things like they said, like swimming lessons. And I think really listening to this and how we direct funding, not just the fact that there is a funding source, but how we basically say we're going to spend some of the funds. And it seems like that's what we need to be focusing on. And I know that's what we heard in our listening sessions as well. Thank you.
Thanks. I see Alex is next.
Hi, everyone. I just want to congratulate Amanda and Maddie for completing the needs assessment. It was a pleasure collaborating with you both. One major takeaway from the presentation just now is that I have is many of the folks on this call represent entities in Connecticut and New York. And these are two states within our nation that represent the highest levels of income inequality. The sound, was, has been the sound has been designed for a select few to benefit from it to date. It's imperative that opportunities to support community-based organizations to increase their accessing the sound is crucial, and really make the connection on how certain waterways inland make their way to the sound, and help folks realize that intersection. I just want to, underscore everything Maddie had communicated regarding incentives to get more groups participating and recognized for their time and compensated for their time. It's very important. It will go a long way in addressing the income inequality that exists in both states, and hopefully bring more faces to this room in the future.
Thanks so much. And just as a quick FYI, I guess I am also guilty of this. I work with the EPA, by the way. Alex Rodriguez works with Save the Sound. Denise Savageau, she's with the Association of Conservation Districts for Connecticut, I believe. So if you would be willing to say, if you're with an organization, which organization you're with, and I will turn it over to Adrian. Who?
Well.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation today. It was extremely eye-opening for me. My family is from Bridgeport and has been here since 1881, and I can confess that I had no idea that there was anybody in Bridgeport who didn't know where the sound was, hadn't been to Seaside Park, and know how to swim. That's another story. So I think what the expo has taught us is that as soon as we can get to some of our youth groups in towns and cities that are along the sound, and tell them about this this conundrum of being next to a fabulous resource like this and not taking advantage of it or knowing where it is such a waste. I can't express how shocked I am that that people don't know about it. We have the fortunate situation in Bridgeport of having Seaside Park. There are probably towns and cities along the coast that don't have any such access. So maybe we are in a very privileged situation, but I can't tell you how crowded that place is on any given holiday or weekend. I just invite anyone who hasn't experienced Seaside Park during the high holidays of July 4th, for instance, try going down there and not starting to dance because there's so much Brazilian music. So there are ways of taking advantage of our situation, and I just would hope that we can find a way to get the information out to all the community groups, all of the CBOs, about just getting down to the ocean and putting your foot in. From there, I think the rest of the education could flow more naturally and be more pervasive in our communities. But the awareness, I'll be happy to spend any time we can to raise the awareness about the sound. And the second piece of information I'd like to give you all is that in Bridgeport, our south end is extremely vulnerable in terms of flooding. And of course, that's due to the way our rain system and evacuation system for water works, as well as the tides coming in from Long Island Sound. And we are concerned about sustainability and looking toward working on sustainability hubs. And I look forward to speaking to Maddie again about some of those things and seeing how we can cooperate with your organizations to increase the sustainability and barriers that we need to escape the flooding and escape the vulnerabilities of our communities that are along the Sound. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you be willing to drop your hand so I don't get it confused in the
There
future?
we go. I'm trying to.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just put my hand up because Denise Savageau did put in the chat that it was really important to include the Indigenous peoples around the Sound, as they are a very important part of the communities and the history, and that's very true. And I just wanted to let everybody know that as the tribal liaison for EPA for Long Island Sound, I have been in communications with the 3 federally recognized tribes. Actually, I just found out yesterday, 2 days ago, that there's a 4th federally recognized tribe that just recently gained property within Massachusetts. So I'm going to be working on that situation as well. It's not trust, but anyway, I am working on those relationships, and I'm working on drafting the official consultation process that's required. Because those organizations are first identified by their political organization, their sovereignty as governments, and then the non-federally recognized tribes. We definitely are working with them, and we have had the privilege of speaking to those organizations through the extension professionals and through Shahela's outreach with LISS, and we continue to try to strengthen those relationships as well. I don't see any other hands right now, but again, if any of the Bill, okay.
Yeah, sorry. Just a couple of quick things. One, you just said something that was interesting. So there is no formal consultation process right now, because that was a Jimmy Carter executive order that wasn't ratified by Bill Clinton, but it was ratified a long time ago. So how has
no, I'm sorry. Yeah,
okay.
so there is a formal consultation process.
Okay.
That formal consultation process includes me drafting a document that puts together the timeline and make sure they know exactly what's happening, and so so the federally recognized tribes have the opportunity to provide meaningful input in a timely manner so that it can be effective. We are definitely following all those procedures, but the first part of that is me drafting together what's our proposed consultation process look like for Long Island Sound Study.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, sorry, I was just kind of got my radars up because I know it gets
sorry
ignored.
About that. Sorry,
it gets ignored a lot, so I just want to make sure. It sounds like you're on top of it. But and then another thing is related to the of like, how do we go about advertising, access shoreside events and things like that, doing it through this group potentially. For example, we're going to be we've got some of the Justice Department funding in last year's budget. Thank you, Alex, for making that happen. And we're going to do a big snorkel day with Project Oceanography. And, I'm just trying to figure out ways to advertise that, and maybe in some non-traditional ways. So just looking for help on that.
Thanks for joining us, Denise. Thank you, Bill. I can't remember whether it was Maddie or Jimena. I think it was Maddie that was next.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up and say thanks so much to Denise for raising that. And we did talk to several tribes through this process, and it's really important that we explicitly include that. And so we'll make sure to do so. And I also saw in the chat that Trip had asked what the most surprising thing that we learned this year was. And I wanted, for me, I think I wanted to share just how many needs are really connected directly to what the Long Island Sound Study does, how much work can be done. I wanted to uplift everything Denise said around environmental education and giving more information specifically about water quality, making sure information really gets to folks, as well as direct work that can happen around issues like flooding. And so I thought that was really exciting, maybe not surprising, but really exciting in terms of how many, direct next steps I think there will be from this work.
Maddie, will the slides be made available?
Yeah, we can definitely make the slides available.
Excellent. Then yes, the slides will be made available. We're not ready to release the report yet. That's still getting finalized. When it is ready to go, that's when we will circulate that. Jimena, you are next.
Yeah, I just wanted to address Tripp's question in the chat. Maddie already did so, but I guess I will say for me, I don't know that I found anything very surprising. But I will say, I think what was very impactful for me was seeing, well, I think two things. One was seeing like the way the distribution of how people access the sound, and how it's really that I think that surprised me how it really matches, you know, the income brackets and like to that degree. And I think the other thing that was, again, I don't think it was surprising, but it was an interesting thing to experience and a lesson learned was that this was really difficult. And I think we knew that going into it, but we really wanted to be out there on the field, and it took a lot of time and effort organizing these meetings, and we sometimes we wouldn't have enough people, a lot of people show up. But I think one of the valuable lessons I got from this was that going to places like libraries and community centers was really one of the most effective ways we were able to talk to people, because we could just sit there and people coming in and out, we could talk to them and get their thoughts. And yeah, again, not surprising, but it was just an interesting experience to go through and to kind of learn that.
Thanks so much. I don't believe, in answer to Anne's questions, I believe the PowerPoint you can share with with people once you get it. It's not a problem. I see a comment in the chat from Adesua Watson. I'm sorry if I messed up your name. Thank you for reaching out to our office, because many of the communities along Long Island Sound here in Suffolk are more affluent and in turn not as diverse. It's wonderful to know that there's still a great effort to include diverse voices. As someone mentioned, recognizing the intersections and how we are all impacted by environmental factors. So that's that comment. I also see Diana, you're up, and Jimena, would you be willing to drop your hand? Thanks. Diana Williams.
Hi, how are you? So I represent the area in Mount Vernon, and we had a very passionate meeting, I guess you would call it. There were lots of people voicing lots of different opinions. And one of the concepts that came up was environmental, and I think the word was used was courtesy. And how the participants explained this is that in many ways, they didn't want to have any kind of recreational activity around the Hutchinson River, which is an estuary, because they were afraid that once humans got involved, somehow they would interfere with the equilibrium of all the other plant life and animal life within the Long Island Sound. And it was voiced by a couple of people who felt that humans were bad actors when we faced nature, and we have not always been kind to nature. And they were concerned that if we brought in recreation and more human activity, we'd have to worry about garbage and other things that we typically take with us. And especially since we've done such a bad job of taking care of our estuaries and of the Long Island Sound and of our environment, they felt that maybe we should just leave it alone. Repair what needs to be repaired, but let it be.
It's a really interesting perspective. Thank you for providing that today. Darren, did you put your hand back up? Oh no, you put it down. I don't see any more comments in the chat, and I don't see any more hands up. I'm wondering if anybody else. Thank you, Carmetta. I'm wondering if anyone else from the partnership has any thoughts on what they saw today before we go into breakout groups. If not, I think we have time for breakout groups. Just one last chance. I see some comments. I would like to see more resources. This keeps flipping on me for some reason. I would like to see more resources provided on how to include overburdened and underserved groups. I specifically any info on ways to find the best ways to find who are community leaders and best ways to communicate. Thanks so much for that comment. That's something that we think about all the time, and hopefully this will continue. We'll continue to learn more about doing exactly that. I believe the recording will be sent out to everyone who's on this mailing list. So if you received an invite, you will receive a link to the recording. With that, I will say that we'll be going into breakout groups, and I'm going to give it to Jimena to figure that out because she's the one who's doing the breakout groups.
Thank you. Okay, hang on. I'm multitasking and setting up the breakout groups as we speak.
I think we have one more question in the chat from Allison.
Oh, could you look at that, Bessie?
Yeah, sure.
Did any of the surveys identify the beaches that are dirty and more in need of cleanups?
Yeah, good question. Some folks wrote in to surveys about specific areas, and also specific areas were identified in some of the community conversations and interviews that we had. And so a lot of that information will be in the broader report that has many more specific details about each area. Thanks so much.
Thanks, and thank you to everyone who's had to drop off and are gone. We have 50 people left for the breakout sessions.
All right, I'm ready. I'm ready if you are. Before we hop into breakout groups, I did want to shout out Adesoa Watson, who left a comment in the chat. She's one of the people we spoke with, and she's been awesome to partner with. So thank you so much, Adesoa. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and put you all in breakout groups. And so what you're gonna see now is each of your facilitators has a document with a little bit more detailed information about some of the broad themes that came up in the needs assessment. So with your facilitators, you'll be able to kind of look at that and begin thinking through, potential next steps for us, right? So how about if we come back at, what does the agenda say, 11:40? That would give them what? Is that 15 minutes?
It's 10 minutes to, yeah, 15 minutes.
What about we come back at 11:45?
I'm good with that. Also, just remember this is just the beginning. We'll be doing more in-depth discussions and really trying to develop some actual action items from these results. And so this is just our first foray into discussion.
All right. With that, I am going to open the breakout groups. Just a couple more seconds. There's some groups still finishing up.
Hey, everybody. I think we're just going to wait until everybody's back. And I will let Jimena run this part because she's a rock star.
Welcome back to those pouring in. We've got 10 more seconds, so I think there's still people who are wrapping up some final thoughts. I'm gonna share my screen. All right. Oh, that looks really tiny, doesn't it? Hang on. Stop sharing. Let me. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is super quick share out because we don't have much time left of this meeting. I would say if you had time to discuss both questions, maybe share you know, one big topic of conversation that came up from each. If you only have time for one question, maybe two for that one question, and then on to the next group. All right. So group one. Oh, hang on. I'm not. Am I sharing my screen? I'm not. Am I? There we go. Now I'm sharing my screen. Right? You can see the Jamboard.
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. So does anybody from Breakout One want to share?
Yeah, I can share, Jimena. We discussed a lot of ways to think about increasing notifications for both the positive as well as the negative. So making sure communities understand about when there are, you know, CSO sewage releases, and that they, you know how to use resources like the Sound Health Explorer. But also it would be great to promote when the water is safe and where you can safely fish and shellfish on that side. We also talked about helping communities understand, you know, what's public and what's private, and putting that together in one place, perhaps putting together activities relating to the sound in one place. And then we talked about some interesting ideas like ways to make parking more equitable and cost effective, and thinking about the trade-offs between access and protecting sensitive natural habitat, and also thinking about how access might change, you know, with coastal displacement, you know, and the opportunity for reclaiming, you know, wildlands. So there's a lot to sink into. I know you have to get through the other groups, so I'll pass along. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. And what was your subject?
We were talking about access and safety.
Got it. Thank you so much. All right, group two, whoever wants to share, and could you tell us what your subject or your theme was?
Hi, I'm Sarah Schaefer Brown, so I was leading group two, and our focus was on flooding and erosion issues in Long Island Sound. And our group discussed a couple things, but really I think the major theme was you know, making sure that when we're talking to when we're considering flooding and erosion issues, that we're also looking at, you know, the state resources that have identified where environmental justice communities are and where that overlap may be, and that might help us prioritize certain projects to work on, and also making sure that we're, you know, including all of the communities that we should in the conversation, and then also communicating with communities that they may be within those areas with you know, higher environmental justice concerns, so that they can take advantage of resources and maybe improve funding opportunities to make improvements in their community. But also having the sense of not really knowing exactly how to communicate that a community is indeed an environmental justice community, without, making, labeling that community or making them feel that they're, this is somehow, their fault. So I think Long Island Sound Study could maybe help promote that these tools are out there, but also provide more resources to partners and communities on how to communicate the environmental justice needs assessment and information, and then, how to use their community's characteristics to their best of their advantage. We also just discussed land acquisition could be something that could benefit. And then we didn't get too far along on question 2. But making sure that signs are translated into English and Spanish, whether it's, educational information or bad news. Often I think signs are only translated if it's like bad news, like a safety concern. And then, encouraging there to be more funding available for public sewer and water infrastructure for all communities. Because accessing funding for improvements there can be a huge barrier, especially in lower income communities or communities that don't have a lot of resources.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. Group 3, and what was your theme?
Hi, so I'm Abby Winter from Connecticut Deep. I was with the third group to talk about water and air quality concerns and infrastructure. So right off the bat, there was ideas for engaging with the municipalities, and then also connecting with different groups that are already doing this work to fill in those need gaps. And then Tiara had a really good point on improving education on the connection between air quality and water quality, especially for folks that are living in industrialized places. And then we dove into a conversation inspired by the infrastructure part of our prompt, really teasing out kind of access and transportation. So first thinking about what is the collaboration between the states, the coastal states, and DOTs. And then we didn't actually get around to the second question. Time flew by. So this did address the idea of some of the systemic issues that we're facing when we're talking about the infrastructure issues and the access issues. So yeah, the idea to see if and make sure there's collaboration between DOT and the access to these coastal resources. And then Maddie brought up the good point that in New York, there's a pilot project happening to connect DOT or shuttle services with beach access. So keeping an eye out for that pilot, seeing how that works, and keeping a close pulse on that idea. And that's as far as we got.
That was great, Abby. Thank you. All right, group 4. What was your subject?
Hi, this is Lily from New York Sea Grant LISS Outreach in New York City and Westchester County. Our topic was information and engagement, and we talked about how it would be great to identify different groups that are already doing engagement and sharing of information and provide them support to get this messaging out. We talked a bit about swimming lessons, and that could be part of the engagement and education to help people feel comfortable getting in and around the water and making sure that young people especially are having access to the information and the engagement opportunities. And then for our second question, let's see, we kind of blended the two questions together, but talking about the water quality issues and how the difference between like what's bad water quality for swimming versus, what could be potentially dangerous in terms of consumption of seafood from the waters, and getting that information out as well, like was previously mentioned. A lot of times, information is translated that's not helpful, but just like warnings or asking people not to enter, but maybe having helpful information about how to properly consume fish. And then also making sure that we're pairing information and engagement programs with other activities, things like exercise programs, making sure people are getting out and walking and getting healthy while they're accessing the information. So
Thanks so much, Lily. All right, group 5, and what was your subject?
So we were looking at environmental disconnection, and a lot of this conversation that we had time to have, I'm sure we would have explored more, was revolved around the limited access, public access, and all the barriers that are even when there is an access point. We talked about some potential short-term projects that could come out of our indicators team. For those of you who don't know the indicators team, it's a Long Island Sound study, kind of tracks numbers and seeing how well we're doing. And one of those numbers that we track is access points. And as we've learned lessons through tracking that, we could come up with some ideas that could be more on the shorter term, but that quickly led into the longer term conversation. If you want to go to the next one, and how I'll have to organize this for you, but the systemic issues that are behind this are even when we have public access points, sometimes they're taken away for other priorities, right? Who has the power to make those decisions? Why is that power structure respected in the way that it is over relationships of the community? That still happens. And other limitations that we didn't go into too. There's also the question, not just the physical placement of an open access point, but the quality and the health of that location too. And it has a similar power structure and systemic solutions that we really need to think about and how to revisit those.
Okay, thank you so much, Kate. And I'm just to be mindful of time, I see we have 2 more minutes. So if we could, resume the rest of the groups pretty quickly, maybe one idea, 1 or 2 ideas per group, that would be great.
Sure. So we looked at systemic issues and social and public health issues that were brought up during the needs assessment. We talked about ways to protect and enhance sustenance fishing and gathering options as like a way of addressing food insecurity. We talked about education and kind of flipping the narrative on whether or not what needs apply to Long Island Sound, instead asking the question of how does Long Island Sound apply to your needs? And then the next question, we did take a moment to talk, and I need to see it. And we were talking about how the history of being unwelcome is a systemic long-term issue, and that we need to come up with projects where we're building an expectation of welcomeness and safety. And so that's it.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Bessie. Group 7, what was your subject? And one or 2 ideas.
Sure. Yes. Our group, like group number 1, was focused on access to waterways and safety concerns. And so one thing we discussed was that LISS could, or its partners could possibly be doing is in thinking about land acquisition projects. We could try to target some properties to acquire and use them for public access. And part of that would be we acknowledge that there are database of public access sites across both states, but maybe we could do an assessment of potential access sites based on some of the limiting factors that were found in the needs assessment. And then we could target those properties for possible acquisition. And then on the second question, we kind of lumped our 2 questions together, but we did a lot of thinking, about what could be done. And one thing that we discussed was just, in the CCMP revision, making sure to incorporate a lot of these concerns into objectives and doing some more thinking about things that LISS and its partners could be doing in terms of communicating and potential things that could be on the LISS website and things like that. So I'll stop right there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Sure.
Group 8, what's your theme and 1 or 2 ideas?
Hi, my name is Sarah Schechter, and for Group 8, our themes were water and air quality and infrastructure concerns. And so for the first question, we focused a lot on the using outreach and engagement, and also partnering with other organizations who are doing similar things in those areas. And one big thing being doing water testing, and even including the community in that, doing demonstrations so that people are aware of what goes into water testing and how to make sure that their water is safe. And then for the second question, we were looking at the importance of really knowing where those issues are and being able to share that with municipal officials. And once you're aware of what the problems are and where they're isolated to, then you can start actually making changes directly in those spaces rather than trying to focus on huge areas all at once.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much. Group 9, what's your theme and 1 or 2 ideas?
Hey guys, Maggie from Connecticut Sea Grant, LISS Outreach. We talked about expanded educational opportunities and outdoor rec opportunities similar to Lily's group. We mostly focused on expanding partnerships or supporting partnerships with nonprofits to get people out on the water. Particularly targeting youth to do that, and maybe using creative ideas like family fun days or food trucks to draw people to Long Island Sound, and then some sort of follow-up engagement activity at the beach, whether it's a swimming lesson or seining or something like that. You can go to the next slide. And then for the systemic issues, we've really highlighted transportation, since that was pretty directly involved with what we were specifically talking about for this breakout session. So expanding transportation opportunities, alleviating those barriers, maybe tying Long Island Sound into everyone's everyday activities, and offering, a food pantry near the Sound or healthcare walks, as was highlighted in the meeting, and making people feel welcome as well.
Thank you, Maggie. And last but certainly not least, Group 10.
We spoke about the disconnection from the environment, similar to Kate's group, regarding impacting social issues and human health, and increasing interest and education. So for this question, a lot of the participants brought up that Long Island Sound Study can do just organized outings and to bring the public out for fishing, just increasing access to the waterway. Normally organizations don't really have funding to do so. So creating more programs where people can learn about, what fish is healthy, having it in different dialogues or languages, breaking down the licensing that's needed to do so. And one person from Bridgeport's Pleasure Beach said that the bridge was burned down. So rebuilding this bridge could decrease overpopulation for visiting these spaces and also increase access. And then if you want to move to the next question. So for the systemic issues and what LISS can do to alleviate it, this was something that our group said that was challenging, and we're not really sure how LISS could address this, or how people can be made to feel safe or increase time to, spend in the waterfront. Another person said that knowing which beaches are harmful or dirty, just increasing the knowledge of these areas will increase participation and cleanups and things like that. And I did indicate that Jimena does organize a lot of beach cleanups and things like that. So increasing programming on that end. Thanks.
All right, awesome. Well, that wraps up our breakout groups. The last item on our agenda is just asking you all whether there are any updates or any news or anything that you would like to share with the group before we adjourn. And just feel free to either stick it in the chat or raise your hand or come off mute.
I want to thank everybody for staying on no matter what, but my big thing is a big congratulations to Jimena and Amanda and I've forgotten the name of Duda, Miss Duda.
Maddie.
Yeah, because Jimena's actually been working on this project for 2 years, and it's been a huge lift, and so congratulations to all of them.
Thanks, and thanks so much for, I'll echo thanks Amanda and Maddie, and thank you to Lily and Deb and Shahela. And I'm blanking. Wait, I'm so sorry, but the team has been so great. Like it could not have been possible without you. Kate, that's who I was missing. I'm sorry. And one final thing I will say, like I said, this is the beginning. We will continue these conversations. This will also become easier once we have the report and we are able to kind of see more in detail what the specifics within communities are. One final thing I'll say is that if this is your first time coming to one of these meetings and you would like to keep coming, feel free to put it in the chat so that we can include you, in the emails that we send. We meet quarterly. And like I said, this is the beginning of, thinking through how to incorporate what we found through the assessment in our work and in the comprehensive conservation management plan. So yeah, I think with that, I'll wrap it up unless anybody else has any final thoughts or ideas or questions or announcements.
I just want to say thank you, the whole team, all the work that went into what was presented today, the presentation, really terrific job. So just thank you, everyone.
So much, Mark. All right.
Thanks for your extra time, guys.
Thank you. With that, have a lovely rest of your Thursday.
Bye-bye.